Thanks so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be a part of this really cool sounding project. I'm going to try to share my screen now if the cat will let me. Okay, have I succeeded? Yeah. Okay, great. In order to see my slides, I'm actually going to close the window so I won't be able to see you either, Mark. So if something goes wrong with the sound or with the slides advancing, you'll have to speak up and tell me, okay?
All right, I'll do it. Thank you.
All right, cool. All right, so yes, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm giving a talk called Saying the Quiet Part Loud, How Fig Leaves Facilitate the Rise of Blatant Racism and Falsehood in Political Discourse. Trying to advance my slides. I'm going to start before giving the talk, however, by doing something I've learned to do since I moved to Canada, which I did just before the pandemic after having lived in the United Kingdom, which is to acknowledge the land that I'm on and the rightful occupants of that land. This is the official University of Waterloo land acknowledgement with a bit of an addition by me. So the official land acknowledgement is, I acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract, land promised to the Six Nations, which includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. And it's all put in that kind of passive voice that there was this promise, but somehow I'm here. So I think it's important to call attention to the fact that the promise was in fact broken and that Indigenous people are still fighting extremely hard to have even very minimal rights to use the land. And I think it's especially important to talk about these issues since I'm going to be giving a talk on racism and falsehood. So I'm not going to be focusing on this, but I wanted to be sure not to neglect it. I also want to call attention to the fact that my talk will be discussing and quoting various utterances that contain hate speech. So what I'm going to do here is attempt to extract a talk from my book in progress. This is only the second time that I've tried to do this. So I have a book draft called Saying the Quiet Part Loud, How Dog Whistles and Fig Leaves Facilitate the Rise of Blatant Racism and Falsehood in Political Discourse. And to give the talk that I want to give today, that gives you that connects the racism and the falsehood together, I need to pull from various different parts of the book. So a lot of what I say will be a little bit oversimplified at times, and there will be a lot of things that I'm leaving out. And I have a lot more to say on pretty much all of the topics I'm discussing, so you should feel very free to ask me about that in questions. So here is the basic starting point for my inquiry. These are all images that I think are probably pretty familiar to you. Over the last few years, that's been a widespread sense, especially in the US, but not emphatically not only in the US, that blatant racism and blatant falsehood have gone mainstream. As I'm going to discuss a bit further, obviously racism isn't new and falsehood in politics isn't new, but there is a widespread sense that there's been a really dangerous and disturbing mainstreaming of these things. And that's my starting point. What I'll be suggesting here is that looking at some mechanisms that have allowed blatantly racist speech to become increasingly widespread can help us to understand at least something about how blatantly false speech has also become increasingly widespread. Some of the same mechanisms are involved, so there are connections to be drawn there. My focus is on political discourse, and I'm going to be focusing even more narrowly on a particular linguistic mechanism that I think has contributed to this spread. So I'll start on part 1 by talking about the blatantly racist speech. And I want to be clear what I mean by this and what's new and what isn't new. Obviously, racism's been deeply embedded in politics and society for a very long time, and racist speech has been too. But what seems to be new with respect to the period since the civil rights era is the acceptability of very overtly expressing that racism in national politics. Now, you might think, with quite a bit of, reason behind this, that maybe we, this is not something to care about. Racism never went away. Racism was there before. Why should we care whether it's blatant or not? I think there's a lot of appeal to that thought. And we certainly should care about the racism that isn't blatant. But I think there are special reasons to care about racism becoming increasingly blatant. One reason is that blatantly racist speech has been shown to lead to increased racist violence. So I'll give a couple examples of this. As I said, this phenomenon is not just a US phenomenon. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson compared women in niqabs to letterboxes and bank robbers. And in the week after he did that, reported anti-Muslim incidents in the UK increased by 375%. Now, you might think that perhaps people are just more inclined to report it because they're really conscious of this after Boris Johnson said that. But in fact, 42% of the street-based incidents being reported actually used Johnson's language of letterboxes and bank robbers. And before Johnson's utterance, these were not common ways to refer to women in niqabs. This wasn't standard hate speech. So there was clearly an effect of that utterance. There have been studies done of the effects of Trump's speeches, controlling for all sorts of other things. Counties that hosted a Trump rally had double the hate crime rates of counties that didn't. In experiments, presenting people with Trump quotes derogating immigrants leads people to subsequently express more negative views about immigrants. So there seems to be a causal mechanism from the Trump speeches, which are blatantly racist, to the racist hate crimes. And of course, there is a great deal of historical evidence that blatant hate speech does make things worse. And in fact, that it plays a crucial role in things like genocide. Now, this, as I said, this has been a change. So I want to now take a step back in time to what was not a bygone golden age. It was still a very problematic time, but to the way things were 15 years ago or so, and what the experts on political speech said then. So here's a bit of old conventional wisdom from the political psychologist Hurwitz and Peffley, writing in 2005. They wrote, "One must wonder if the norm of political correctness and the fear of being accused of racialization have driven racial appeals even further underground, possibly to the point where virtually any presentation of race in audible or printed narrative or in pictures has become practically verboten. If so, the racialization of politics will increasingly take place mainly at the level of code words, or words that are fundamentally non-racial in nature, that have, through the process of association, assumed a strong racial component. We may presuppose that modern battles will be far less obvious in nature and will rely instead on the subtle introduction of strategic words or phrases with racial connotations." So the racism had to be subtler and subtler, and going forward in the future, it would just continue to get more and more subtle, which is a surprising thing to read from our current vantage point. So what was the theory behind that? Well, as I said, after the civil rights movement, it became widely but not universally frowned on by white Americans to be overtly racist. That became socially unacceptable. And it came to be the case, or at least it was widely thought, that when it comes to running for national office, you just couldn't be elected in America if you explicitly argued for segregation or discrimination on the basis of race, or if you make claims of racial biological inferiority. So there's certain things that you just couldn't do because they'd be too overtly racist. And Tali Mendelberg, political psychologist, called this the norm of racial equality. So I'll be taking over her terminology there. But at the same time, and this is something Mendelberg called attention to when talking about this norm of racial equality, she said there was this tension going on in the minds of white Americans because overwhelmingly white Americans thought it was socially unacceptable to be overtly racist. But nonetheless, they continued to display high levels of what psychologists call racial resentment. Racial resentment is measured by the tendency to agree with sentences like this one. It's really just a matter of some people not trying hard enough. If Blacks would only try harder, they could be just as well off as whites. So lots of white Americans had a tendency to say yes to that kind of sentence, but at the same time, to adhere to what Mendelberg calls the norm of racial equality, which might seem strange because this doesn't seem like a very racially equal sentiment to have. So how did these coexist? Well, the answer goes back to what the norm of racial equality actually says. And Mendelberg never actually formulates what that norm says. She just tells us some of the things that it rules out. But thinking about how it functions, that it's widely accepted and yet lets people assent to those racial resentment items, I've come to think that the simplest way to formulate it is as don't be racist, which is an extremely widely accepted norm, but it's fundamentally not very action guiding. It leaves it up to each individual person to decide for themselves what counts as racist. And they'll find themselves having lots and lots of reasons to suppose that things that might seem racist really aren't racist, either about themselves or about people who they want to support politically or in other ways. But nonetheless, for quite some time, this constrained the really explicit expressions of racism. This norm of racial equality made politicians nervous about being too blatant. And that led to strategies of concealment. Chief strategy amongst these is the use of what are called dog whistles, because they can't be fully, they're not fully heard by all members of the audience, roughly speaking, in the same way that dogs hear the dog whistles and people don't. The idea behind these strategies of concealment was to find a way to get the votes of the racially resentful white people, or even the really openly racist white people, without turning off other people who might vote against you if you're too obviously racist. Now, I could say a lot about these strategies, and I have, and I've got lots of details I could go into, but I'm just going to give you some quick examples. So I think of dog whistles as coming in two varieties that work very, very differently from each other. So the first variety is what I call the overt code dog whistle. And this works like a code. It's an utterance that has different meanings for different audiences. The message is meant to be consciously received and decoded, just as, you know, a message like Sergey is coming to tea. You know what that means? Yes, Sergey is coming to tea would be. Okay, so you've got different messages for different audiences. One example of this would be something like, it's important to remember our heritage. And the idea is that a lot of the audience will hear that simply as a statement about history being an important thing, while another audience will see it as an affirmation of white heritage or racism. Even more code-like, we get things like the widespread white supremacist use of the number 88 as a code for Heil Hitler, because H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. And as a kind of interesting ambiguous code, we get the traditional OK sign, which has become a code for white power because the shape that your hand makes when you make an OK sign can look a bit like a P and a W. And we get lots of nice pictures of Steve Bannon making the OK sign. But at the same time, there are going to be lots of people making the OK sign because they mean OK. And this introduces ambiguity that, that turns out to be actually very useful for people who want to use dog whistles. As I said, I could say a lot more about that. Another variety of dog whistle is what I call a covert effect dog whistle or a covert dog whistle. And this is a dog whistle in which the real purpose is meant to be hidden from everyone, including those it's directed at. They're not meant to realize that something racial is going on. So the idea is to get them to make decisions on the basis of their racial resentments, to vote their racial resentment without realizing that they're doing that. So a common way of doing this is using racialized images, which may summon up people's racial attitudes without them being aware that that's happening. And the Willie Horton ad is a standard example of that. As I said, this is very, very brief, and you should feel free to ask for more questions. This is just kind of the prehistory part of the talk. Because then we get to the startling thing that happened that went against what Hurwitz and Peffler were saying, what everyone was expecting. And in fact, what I thought I'd be doing when I planned to spend 2016 writing about dog whistles and other subtle forms of racist speech. There was a sudden shift to a whole lot less concealment of the racism. And I want to talk about what happened with that. Much more blatant racism seemed to become more socially acceptable. We saw Donald Trump succeeding in politics with much more blatant racism, the sort that should have been impossible according to the conventional wisdom before. Candidates are saying racist things which would previously have been expected to doom their candidacy and yet succeeding. Now, there were a lot of factors that went into bringing this about, especially in the case of Donald Trump. I'm not going to be talking about all of those factors, but I am going to be talking about one linguistic device that I think is really interesting and that hasn't gotten enough attention. This is what I call a fig leaf. So this is a part of the explanation. A fig leaf is traditionally used in art to cover something that you're not supposed to show in public. And I take it to be doing that with respect to racism and politics as well. I mean, not the same kind of fig leaf, a more metaphorical fig leaf. So the way I understand a fig leaf roughly, as I said, I could talk a lot more about this and give you more complicated definitions, but it's an additional bit of language that serves to cast doubt on the idea that a speaker who would otherwise be clearly recognized as having made a racist utterance is racist, or that their utterance is racist. So a speaker says something R, which would normally seem really racist, but then they add on a fig leaf, this additional bit of language, and the audience is no longer so sure that there's something racist going on here. The fig leaf blocks the inference from the utterance to the belief that the speaker is racist. Now, the reason this strategy can succeed, and I'll be giving you a bunch of examples as we go on, is that, for one thing, the norm of racial equality is, as we've seen, really thin and open to interpretation. There's lots of room for convincing yourself that something isn't racist because it's up to you to decide. Each person gets to determine what they think is required to follow the norm. And white people in America, not all of them, but quite a lot of white people in America subscribe to what Jane Hill, a sociolinguist, calls the white folk theory of racism. And this is a theory that a lot of white Americans hold about how racism works. And this theory hopefully offers lots of ways to reassure yourself that you're not racist, or that a person who you're supporting or wanting to support is not racist. So here are a few key bits of this theory. One is that only people can be racist, not language or institutions. Another tenet is that people are only racist if they're consciously and intentionally hateful toward all members of a group. So that's quite a high bar there. And third, and I find this a really interesting one, people often mistakenly say racist sounding things, but that's not the truth about them because they're not racist in their hearts. So the truth about people is to be found in their hearts, even though their heads might lead them to say racist sounding things. And when I first read her saying that, I thought, well, that's a really kind of weird theory. I see that you got some examples of that, but I've never heard anybody say that kind of thing. And then the very next day, Kellyanne Conway actually instructed reporters that the media should cover what's in Trump's heart rather than what he actually says, which is just a remarkable bit of advice to give to reporters. Don't report what the president's saying. Instead, report what's in his heart. So with all of that in place, it becomes possible to use fig leaves, these additional utterances, to provide some reassurance that what might have sounded racist isn't really racist. So I'll start with some very simple fig leaves, which will probably be too simple for all of you. The classic, I'm not racist, but followed by R, the racist claim. This is such a classic that, probably when you hear someone say, I'm not racist, but you sort of tense up thinking, oh God, they're going to say something awful. The same for some of my best friends are Black, but are the racist claim. And these are what I call synchronic fig leaves. They're fig leaves that are uttered along with R, the claim that would otherwise be recognized as racist. These particular fig leaves are not going to work for you. There are going to be lots of audiences they don't work for because they're widely known and they're mocked. There are a whole, there are whole Tumblr blogs devoted to these particular fig leaves. And, if that happens, then they're just attempted fig leaves. But not all fig leaves are so simple. So here is a more sophisticated fig leaf, which comes from Trump's announcement of his candidacy. Trump said, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with them. They're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. So most of the focus, quite reasonably, about this quote was that Trump was calling Mexicans rapists. But there was also other stuff going on that was really strange that I think is important. And the other stuff going on is the fig leaves. So there's this focus on the Mexicans who are sent. They're not the best ones. Okay. Well, if you think that to be racist, somebody has to be equally prejudiced against all members of a group, then this is going to reassure you that this isn't somebody who's racist because they think that Mexicans are different from each other. There are some who are good and some who are bad. And then slapped on the end is that sort of all-purpose fig leaf. And some, I assume, are good people. Meant to reassure you again that this person likes some of them and thinks they're good people, so they couldn't possibly be racist. And so I heard that, and that's what got me thinking about fig leaves in the first place, wondering, could that actually be serving that function for Trump's supporters? Well, it seemed to be pretty important for people defending Trump. So Mike Pence was reminding reporters, he also said, and many of them are good people. You keep leaving that out of your quote. Now, of course, Mike Pence actually improves the fig leaf here by removing the qualifier, some of them, I'm sure, which is a bit of a doubt raiser, and changing some to many. But he's trying to go for the same thing there. But then I had a look during the 2016 presidential campaign at pro-Trump discussion groups online where people were discussing whether or not Trump was racist and reassuring each other that he wasn't, which I thought was in itself a really interesting phenomenon, that there were Trump supporters who wanted to vote for him, but were worried that he was racist. They weren't happy with that. And they cited these fig leaves in reassuring each other. I think Trump's attacking them based on their actions, not their ethnicity. He's attacking the illegal immigrant group, not the race group they belong to. I didn't hear him say anything racist against any race. What I did hear him say is illegal Mexicans bring drugs, crime, and are rapists, but I'm sure some are good people. Seriously, what's racist about that? Trump is not racist. Trump is not against all Mexicans, just the illegals. They seem to have picked up on the key elements of that quote that serve as fig leaves. Now, the reason I think fig leaves are so dangerous is because of the capacity they have to change the way that we think about something like racism. They have the ability to change what we count as racism. So if somebody says, take this claim R, which is some obviously racist sounding thing, they say it with the fig leaf and you accept the fig leaf, then R now seems to you like the sort of thing a non-racist would say, because you're thinking this person's not racist, despite having said R. People who accept Trump's fig leaf about Mexicans, they come to think that it's not racist to say that Mexicans are rapists. And that's a really shocking change in what counts as racism, and a really dangerous change in what counts as racism. So because of that ability to change what we count as racism, I think fig leaves are an especially dangerous linguistic device. Now I'm going to turn to talking about blatantly false speech and draw some analogies. So just as there's nothing new about racism, there's also nothing new about falsehood in political speech. Here's Hannah Arendt writing in 1972. The deliberate falsehood and the outright lie used as legitimate means to achieve political ends has been with us since the beginning of recorded history. Truthfulness has never been counted among the political virtues, and lies have always been regarded as justifiable tools in political dealings. It may be a slight overstatement. There certainly have been some who have counted truthfulness as a political virtue, and some who've thought that lies are not justifiable. But it's broadly true that we've been very aware of the use of falsehood in politics for a very long time. The claim that we're living in a post-truth world where there's just so much falsehood and deception that everything has changed is a fairly recent claim, but it's not just a Trump era claim. So here's one version of it. The public's trust in public speech, whether by politicians or in the media, has disintegrated, and to such a degree that it has undermined the possibility of straightforward communication in the public sphere. The expectation is that any statement made either by a politician or by a media outlet is a false ideological distortion. As a result, no one blames politicians for making false statements or statements that obviously contradict that politician's beliefs. So this was from Jason Stanley writing in 2012, right smack in the middle of the Obama era. And it's surprising from our current vantage point to see someone seeing that era as one with such a flourishing of blatant falsehood. So you might wonder, what was he talking about? Well, he was talking about some things that you probably don't even remember, even if you followed news pretty closely at the time. Paul Ryan had criticized Obama for funneling money out of Medicare, but he himself, Paul Ryan that is, had long argued for funneling money out of Medicare. Mitt Romney had criticized Obama for weakening work requirements on welfare, but what Obama had actually done was to consider issuing waivers to states concerning worker participation targets. Okay, so back in 2012, those looked like incredibly blatant falsehoods. It's hard to even get your head around exactly what the second one is, right? These are the sorts of things that people could find if they went on the internet and they said, oh, Paul Ryan said that. I wonder what Paul Ryan thinks about Medicare. I'll Google around and I'll find out. And they could find that Paul Ryan had argued for the thing that he was criticizing Obama for, right? So it could be found, but these weren't the kinds of claims that are obviously ludicrous on their face that you look at them and you think, what? How could anybody say that this is clearly a bald-faced lie? They can't expect anyone to believe it. So that used to count as incredibly blatant falsehood. But now does in fact seem different. So here are some key ways it seems different. The lack of interest in facts that we get from Trump and company. And I'm considering this all to be current because Trump is still the leader of the Republican Party and the likely next presidential candidate. When pressed to explain why Sean Spicer would utter a provable falsehood, Kellyanne Conway stated that he was giving alternative facts. Classic example here, on the left we have Obama's inauguration, and on the right we have Trump's inauguration. Trump insisted that his crowd was bigger than Obama's. His spokespeople insisted that his crowd was bigger than Obama's. His supporters will insist on that, even if you bring them into the laboratory and ask them, tell them which one is which and ask them, they'll still insist that, if they know that the one on the left is Obama's crowd, they'll look at these photos and they'll say the crowd on the right is bigger if they know that it's Trump's crowd. Now, I'm not saying they actually believe this. There's a lot of really interesting experimental research trying to sort out whether people believe it or are simply asserting it to show their loyalty. I think the fact of asserting obvious falsehoods to show your loyalty is in itself an extremely interesting phenomenon. So we have Trump suggesting that people could maybe inject bleach to fight COVID, and we have his supporters, some of them going off and doing this. It's, for most of us, an unbelievable, obviously ludicrous falsehood, but of course for some people it was believed. We have a huge number of people who say they believe in conspiracy theories, like the one holding that Bill Gates wants to use mass COVID-19 vaccination to implant microchips. And notice this isn't just a Republican issue. We have the rise of the QAnon conspiracy theory, which has become increasingly influential. This holds that there is an insider in the US intelligence agencies leaking information online about a massive ring of Satan worshiping pedophiles in the Democratic Party who Trump is fighting. And that's just a little bit of it. QAnon played a big role as well in the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, along with, of course, the conspiracists holding that the election was stolen. There's a lot of overlap between those groups. Okay, so how to characterize this changed time? A lot of people find it appealing to call this a post-truth era. And I want to say a bit about why I don't like that characterization. These are largely reasons given by Joshua Habgood-Koot. One reason for disliking this characterization is that there are lots of different things people seem to mean when they say a post-truth era. Sometimes they mean that journalism isn't very good and people aren't fact-checking things. Sometimes they mean that people are uttering blatant falsehoods. Sometimes it means that people are making bald-faced lies or that they don't care about truth anymore. There are many, many different things, and I think it's worth teasing those apart and treating them separately rather than lumping them all together. Another reason I think not to use a phrase like post-truth era, also from Habgood-Koot, is that it suggests that we're in some fallen age now in which we're not very good about truth. But the previous era was fabulous at it, that there was this previous golden age of political truthfulness. And that is in many ways very false. And it also is ignoring the ways that the mainstream wisdom and what was put forward as the truth was actually reflecting just one very particular perspective that was leaving out the perspectives of a lot of marginalized people whose views and perspectives just weren't being represented at all. sorry. It also suggests that there's a really neat division into eras. And it's just much messier than that. Okay, so here's how I would want to characterize the change that's taken place. This is a little bit woolly, but I think these are the key features that matter. It's that prominent national politicians are just not concerned about the fact that a huge proportion of the population, including the mainstream media, sees them as propagating falsehoods and conspiracy theories. That's new. It used to be a career ender to be seen that way. Related to this, there's much more prominence in political discourse of conspiracy theories and of other ideas that are seen as obviously false by a lot of the population and also by the mainstream media. And there seems to be little to no political penalty for promulgating falsehoods like these. So those are the things that I take to be new. I don't have a catchy phrase like post-truth era, but I think these are the things that we need to look at. And there are many factors involved in this, but my focus is going to be on how people, especially politicians, get away with obviously false speech of a sort that would previously have doomed their careers. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be arguing there are some really interesting parallels to how people get away with racist speech. So the analogy with racism begins from the fact that once more, we've got a widely accepted norm. Then we have a way of making blatant violations of that norm seem acceptable. Because of that, there's a kind of habituation to these violations. We get used to hearing them over and over again, and the norm can come to be reinterpreted in dangerous ways. So the relevant norm, in this case, analogously to the don't be racist norm, we have the norm, what I call the norm of honesty, which is just be honest. Again, it's widely accepted. It's not universally accepted, but it's widely accepted. And it's very open to interpretation. You can adopt self-serving interpretations that let yourself and those you support off the hook. So you can think, well, I didn't say something false. I just kind of suggested it, and that's okay. Right? So you can choose what you take to be required for honesty. It might be don't say anything false. It might be say all the true things, and you wind up with very different results from those two different interpretations. Now, it is worth noting a difference between this norm and the anti-racism norm, which is that lots of people think this norm doesn't hold in all circumstances. They think it holds generally, but not in all circumstances. And that's not true for the anti-racism norm. So, for example, people might think, yes, you should in general be honest, but sometimes you have to be nice to avoid being cruel, or to be polite, or to keep someone's secret. So, you should generally be honest, but it's okay to say something like, oh, this meal you cooked was really delicious, even if you think that it wasn't, right? And that's a difference from the anti-racism norm, but nonetheless, we've got the general structure of a widely accepted norm that's open to interpretation. Now, just as with racism, the key to getting away with blatant falsehood is to block recognition that the norm is violated, or if not block it, at least raise some doubt about whether the norm's being violated. How do you do that? Well, again, we get the use of fig leaves, which are additional utterances that can keep the audience from inferring that the norm's been violated. Classic fig leaf, it gets used with racism too, is to say that you're joking. So Trump claimed that his comment about injecting disinfectants was just sarcastic. And a fig leaf claiming that you're joking makes a lot of sense. It works well as a fig leaf, because an utterance that would be clearly dishonest in a serious context is just fine in a joking context, because we don't expect all the people's jokes to be truths. We recognize that sometimes you say things to be funny that aren't true. Right? So saying that something was just a joke is a very effective fig leaf. Similarly, for reporting what other people are saying. So here's Ted Cruz. Cruz said, recent polling shows that 39% of Americans believe the election that just occurred, quote, was rigged. You may not agree with that assessment, but it's nonetheless a reality for nearly half the country. So this is a way that Cruz, instead of saying himself the election was rigged, he can say 39% of Americans think the election was rigged. And by doing this, he manages to introduce into the conversation, or to keep in the conversation, the idea that the election's rigged by just reporting what other people are saying about it. There's nothing dishonest about reporting of what other people are saying, even if you're telling us about something false that other people are saying. Sometimes we need to and want to know about the false things that people are saying. But it's a really useful fig leaf for getting falsehoods into the conversation, because by reporting somebody's belief in that falsehood, you insert the falsehood as a topic of conversation. And the more you do that and the more it gets talked about, the more that falsehood gains currency through repetition. So it's a very effective fig leaf for the spread of conspiracies and falsehoods. So much so that there's actually a book about conspiracy theories called A Lot of People Are Saying. It's also a great fig leaf to say that something merits investigation. Again, you don't have to assert it. You can say, this seems really weird, but I think we should look into it. And that injects that idea into the discourse and suggests an investigation of it. So you're not held to the same standard when you're suggesting investigating something that you would be if you were putting it forward as an assertion. And what that means is that if you say, put something up on Facebook saying, this seems kind of weird, maybe someone should look into it, your friend might share that in a way that they wouldn't if you just asserted that thing. So if you assert that thing, they might think, oh, I don't know what Jenny's saying here, I'm not going to share it. And then, but if it's just Jenny saying we should investigate this, what's the harm of that? That seems like something you might share. Similarly, for just asking questions, which functions in pretty much the same way. Saying that something should be investigated isn't saying that it's true. Asking questions doesn't require the same level of justification as asserting something does. And you can seem very reasonable and honest in asking for an investigation or asking questions in a way that you wouldn't if you were just asserting it. Just like we get, I'm not a racist, but we get, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I just do my own research. Or I'm not anti-vax, but, and those function just like I'm not a racist, but. Again, what these fig leaves do is they serve to just give these blatant falsehoods a bit of currency that they wouldn't otherwise have. Each individual usage helps keep somebody's credibility from being undermined when they're saying something which might well undermine their credibility if they were asserting it. The fig leaf makes it just that little bit more acceptable for them to do that. You think, well, she's not saying it's true, she's just making a joke, or she's just saying we should look into this. By doing that, it helps the falsehoods to circulate. People are going to be more comfortable with you, but also more comfortable sharing what you say. In order to do that, you don't have to convince people that what you're saying is true, just that it's kind of worth thinking about. It means that you've put these ideas forward in a way that makes it very difficult conversationally and socially to correct you, because it's quite hard to correct a joke or to correct a call for an investigation. It's much harder to do that. It's not enough to say, what's your evidence for that? Because the response could always be, well, I was just making a joke, I don't need evidence. Or I don't have evidence yet, I'm just saying we should all go out and gather evidence and try to find out about this. And collectively, as lots of people use fig leaves, and as they're used over and over again, they help to keep false claims circulating. The effect of these false claims in circulation can become quite disorienting, as you're surrounded by these claims that seem, obviously false, but they seem to be getting taken a bit seriously. And this can all help to give rise to both conspiracist thinking and conspiracist action. And I'm going to close with another quote from Hannah Arendt, who seems disturbingly relevant to this topic. So here she is in The Origins of Totalitarianism. In an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached the point where they would at the same time believe everything and nothing, think that everything is possible, and that nothing was true. And I think one of the reasons that people have felt the pull of the idea of a post-truth world is the thought that we're moving toward a state of affairs like this, where it just becomes too confusing and difficult to sort out what's true and what isn't. And I think fig leaves have helped to push us in this direction, and that they're continuing to do so. I will stop there. Thanks very much.